CentOS 7 comes with a new firewall, FirewallD. If you're already familiar with IP tables and prefer working with it, you can turn FirewallD off and replace with the good old IP tables. But there are no direct prerequisites to it. It is better to get used to something new. I personally find FirewallD a really good update to IP tables and got used to the new command syntax pretty fast. FirewallD is not a fundamentally new firewall. Actually, it is another add-on for NetFilter. You can see it more clearly on this slide at the moment, so if you have experience with IP tables, then after a short while you will likely love using the new tool. Zones. The FirewallD daemon groups rules into something called zones. Zones are basically sets of rules dictating what traffic should be allowed depending on the level of trust you have in the networks your computer is connected to. Network interfaces are assigned to a zone and dictate the behavior that the firewall should allow. For a server, these zones are not as immediately important because the network environment changes rarely, if ever. But it is still useful to be familiar with the general idea behind each of the predefined zones for FirewallD. In order from least trusted to most trusted, the predefined zones within FirewallD are. You can see them now on the slide, and you can find this slide in PDF in the supplementary materials to this lecture. Rules. It is important to know that in FirewallD, rules can be designated as either permanent or immediate. If a rule is added or modified by default, the behavior of the currently running firewall is modified, but at the next boot, firewall forgets the new rules and the old rules are reverted. Most firewall CMD operations can take the permanent flag to indicate that the firewall should remember these settings permanently. And all the settings with this flag will affect the rule set that is reloaded upon boot. This means that you can test rules in your active firewall instance and then reload if there are any problems with them. Let's now switch to console and take a look at the most important commands you use to control FirewallD. To check if you have FirewallD fired up, you may run this command. This will show information about all the modules of your firewall and their status. To get a short answer, running or not running, you may wish to use this one. We now want to start the firewall, so let's run this command. To make sure firewall starts on every server boot, we use this one. And just for your information, to stop and disable the auto start on server load, use these commands. You see them on the screen at the moment. How do we work with zones? To list all the zones available or pre-configured, you run this one. And to list the active zone, you run this command. Now let's take a look at some very useful commands. These are sometimes even important to know. To block all the traffic on the system, you can use the panic mode. As you can see, this command enables panic mode when you have a non-standard situation and need to cut off the server from the entire world. You can use this command. Just be very careful with it, as you may lose the connection to your server, even via SSH on port 22. So if your hosting provider or cloud provider doesn't provide you a virtual console or KVM access to your servers, you better don't use this command. To turn off the panic mode, to ask if the panic mode is enabled or not, you use this one. To reload all the firewall rules without cutting off current connections, you can run this command. And to reload all the firewall rules and cut off all the current connections, you use this one. It can be very useful if you suspect any unauthorized connections to your server. So now let's go on and set the rules for applications and services that we need for the web server. The easiest method is to add the services or ports you need to the zones you are using. Again, you can get a list of the available services with the Get Services option. To enable a service for a zone, you use the Add Service parameter. The operation will target the default zone or whatever zone is specified by the zone parameter. Remember that you need to use the permanent flag to make these changes permanent. For instance, let's allow the conventional HTTP traffic for interfaces in your public zone by typing this command. By the way, you can leave out the zone parameter if you wish to modify the default zone. Firewall reports that the operation was successful. Let's check it out. Let's fire up the web browser and visit the IP address of our server. As you can see, the dummy page loads up successfully. It means that port 80 is opened. Now let's go on to the command line and restart the firewall service. The rule we added earlier wasn't added permanently, so after the restart, the firewall will forget about this rule. Now when we visit the web page, we see an error. And after we add the rule once more, we again can visit the website. That is why it is very important to add the permanent key to the rules if you want them to be saved after the web server restarts or the firewall daemon restarts. Once you have tested that everything is working as it should, you will probably want to modify the permanent firewall rules so that your service will still be available after the server reboots or the firewall service restarts. To make the public zone change permanent, we type this command with the permanent key. So your public zone will now allow HTTP web traffic on port 80. If your web server is configured to use SSL encrypted traffic, you also want to add the HTTPS service. The firewall services that are indicated with the FirewallD installation represent many of the most common requirements for applications that you may wish to allow access to. However, there are still likely be scenarios where these services do not fit your requirements, or, for example, you use non-standard ports for your services. In this situation, you can open a port for the target or default zone. The easiest way to add support for your specific application is to open up the ports that it uses in the appropriate zones. This is as easy as typing the port or port range and the associated protocol for the ports you need to open. For instance, if your application or, for example, web server runs on port 8080 and uses TCP, we could add this to the public zone for the session using the add port parameter. Protocols can be either TCP or UDP. We can verify that this was successful by typing the list ports operation. just don't forget to repeat the procedure for adding the rule set to enable the services for other services you use, for example, FTP server or whatsoever, for them to be able to operate properly. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to leave them in the comments to this lecture.